again, myself in my office, Dr. Patino in his, and of course, Mr. Teacher Man, Juan Pablo with us. And tonight's subject matter, school violence, teacher and the psychiatrist perspective, also provides two other perspectives. One of the teacher himself, Juan Pablo, who is currently a high school educator, and obviously a little bit myself, who is a person who teaches personal protection, self defense, and the preventative aspects of it. But Dr. Patino, let's start with you. School violence, is it really the epidemic that the media is saying that it is?
Well, school violence is not a new thing. School violence has been present historically for a long time. I think that we have become more aware and more responsive to it over time, in particular because we have paid more attention to the consequences of, right? So, I'm not privileged to see what happens in the school all the time, but I'm privileged to dealing with the consequences of it, right? So if I get ahead of the program and I say, well, what happens to people who are chronically victimized? Then you get into issues of mental health, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, social isolation, suicidal behavior, violence in the most extreme cases. And unfortunately, we tend to focus on the extreme violence, usually involving guns, where more than four people die, and that's actually what attracts media, right? And we've done a couple of programs about Uvalde. We don't hear much about Uvalde much in the news anymore, but we didn't hear much about Parkland back in the day when that happened in Florida. So the reality is that there's kind of like two track issue going on with the violence in the schools. One is the reality of every day, the reality of violence among youth, okay, the risks associated with it, and the kind of like who are the people at risk of suffering the most. Because at the end of the day, if we are to fulfill our duty in terms of training, teaching, educating kids, and helping them be healthy adults, we have to identify who's vulnerable so we can provide them some ways of handling that.
And Juan Pablo, you again, you're a working teacher. You see this every day. You've alluded to before the show, having to break up some fights. Who are these kids that basically are seen as the one to be worried about, for lack of a better term?
Um, I think that since social media has gotten more popular, just in my 7 years as a teacher, I've seen a big switch in the types of kids that get in fights and who is kind of involved in that. I'd say that like when I was a kid and probably when you guys were kids as well, there was more physical bullying of weaker kids or kids that were easily dominated, right? Now I notice a lot of conflicts. Maybe two guys are fighting over a girl, or maybe somebody said something to someone online or in person. And there's this interest in fighting and everyone seeing the fight and the fight
Hmm.
being broadcast on people's social media. This is a story. I mean, these kids could have called my bluff and I probably could have gotten a lot of trouble, but it worked in this case. Last year, I had two kids that were in my class that wanted to fight. And one of them came up to me and said, and he was the one that probably would have won the fight. He came up to me and said, "This kid wants to fight me. I don't want to fight him, but if he comes at me, I'm going to beat him up." And I hallway, both of them out in the hallway, and I said, "You guys want to fight?" And I didn't admit it, and I was like, "All right, go ahead and fight." And I closed the door and I said, "Fight." And they said, "I don't want to get suspended." I was like, "Go ahead and fight. I'm giving you permission. I won't get you guys in trouble. Fight right now." And they didn't fight, right? Obviously, because the teacher was there, but maybe they would have swung on the other guy. I'm kind of lucky, they didn't call my bluff. But I told them, really what you guys want is to resolve this issue. And by talking about it, we were able to resolve the issue. And at the end, I said, if you guys aren't willing to be around each other peacefully, then you need to stay with each other. And they ended up not fighting. Now, if that same thing would have happened and maybe a student was trying to mediate that conversation and there were 50 phones out filming it, I can guarantee that a fight probably would have broken out. which is
I know some of the training I had, we discussed that that's one of the biggest issues is the desire for these individuals to get some type of social acceptance or at least popularity using social media. It's not so much they want to go shoot up the school as that they want everyone seeing them doing it. Dr. Patino, what psychology is behind that?
Well, there's two sides to violence. One is the perpetration, and the other one is the victimization, right? So we kind of dance in between those two extremes. And there are some predictors of those who are, and there's overlap between those two, which is perpetration, victimization. Because sometimes the violence is a way of avoiding further victimization, right? So the predictors of somebody perpetrating violence are we've known for a very long time. There's actually two groups. One is the kids who are genetically antisocial, okay, that have a drive toward resolving problems with violence, and you can actually see it in the family. That had antisocial behavior, has been in jail, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the kid grows up in that environment, both genetically and learning some of those behaviors. And
Nurture
from
and
our,
nature combined.
Exactly. From our perspective, if the kid is manifesting antisocial behavior from the age of 6, 7, 8 years old, that's a really bad sign. There's another group, and we talked about this group recently, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And those kids tend to impulsively act violently and behave antisocially, but usually not until later in life, usually around their 12, 13, 14 years old. Okay. So those two groups are very important for us to understand. But when you look at the people who tend to be more victims, are those who are not very socially accepted, right?
Mm.
And they don't participate a lot. So you have these two extremes that when you put them together, okay, if you have somebody who's antisocial since early in life, he's going to be looking for victims, right? And he's going to find them. And you get into the traditional bullying, right? That you have your slave, you have your person that you're going to make fun of all the time, and is going to make their life miserable. Since the advent of media, this has actually grown into something bigger, which is cyberbullying, right? Which has become also a major issue that ignites processes of violence among kids. And there's another component that I've seen over the last, and I see it in the hospital every day, but I've seen it more coming from school, which is girls fighting with each other,
Mm.
right? I mean, the same behavior that in my generation, 60s, 70s, 80s, we used to see boys showing off their strength, fighting with each other for social acceptance and recognition from the girls, is now generic. It just involves everybody.
Interesting. Do you see that a lot, Juan Pablo? Is it more females lately, or is it still guys? What's the mix?
Last year was a really interesting school year because we were coming off of COVID, where for the majority of time before that, kids had spent their time learning from home and a computer, and it was really clear that it stunted their communication skills, it stunted their development, and there were a lot of fights between young ladies. And
Mm.
oftentimes it was one girl just saying something to another girl. And I mean, that was how they decided to solve the problem. I've definitely seen a lot of that. And those were actually the fights that were violent and escalated further because people didn't want to get in between them. They felt that if they got in between them, maybe they would, hurt the girl or getting in more trouble for getting in there. Whereas when guys would fight, each had a bunch of guy friends who would kind of jump in. So the girl fights that happened at my school last year were bloody. I mean, there were girls who got seriously injured, whereas the guys most of the
Wow.
time, didn't get seriously injured. That was just a it's an anomaly year, right? Like these last few years have been an anomaly. So I don't know if that'll continue to be very, very common. But yeah, I mean, young ladies fighting is definitely on the rise in my experience.
That's crazy. But not unexpected. I think, like you said, we've been away for a while. They come back, and before the show, I mentioned Dr. Tino. In my world, we talk about males having that natural tendencies toward domination, aggression, trying to get someone to submit, trying to make someone their slave. But it's not that true violence of really trying to injure another human being. Whereas females of the species are protecting the young and other things like that. Again, you can very easily YouTube this. Go on YouTube, see guy fights, it's wrestling, punching, kicking. See girl fights, it's pulling hair, biting, and stabbing. Um, is that hardwired into our DNA, or is that a social thing? Because I mean, we are really one of the only few species where the males kill one another on purpose.
Well, you see, and I'm going to walk a fine line here because I don't want to get into all the difference between genders, right? And that's a sensitive issue right now. But there is something to be said about, and we've talked about this before, something we call narcissistic injury, which is you're not fighting to protect yourself or to just demonstrate that you are um, a valuable individual. You are fighting sometimes in a very passionate way. What does that
Mhm.
mean? It means that the passion takes over the intellectual control. And women tend to be more passionate than men, right? So when women loses control, okay, it's going to be more about you are trying to say that I'm not worth anything. When you get to that level of passion, right, is when people kill passionately, right? Like a man that walks into his home and finds a significant other having sex with another person, right? And then kills them both. And then you ask them, why did you kill them? They didn't kill them because they were doing something they weren't supposed to do. Kills them because they did it to him. And that level of passion, whether it's a man or a woman, can be tremendously destructive, right? I mean, you can see that in children, when children get upset and you have bullied them to the point of a passionate rage, and they just won't stop. They just won't stop trying to fight you because they can't. They are out of control. So, what happens is when you get to that level of passion, you're not just being violent, you're trying to destroy the source of your passion or rage. And
Well,
that is tremendously dangerous. We see it sometimes in sports, right? When people lose control. And that is something that we all have to be able to recognize and say, I'm out of control. Because that's the other, I mean, the person at the other end can get seriously hurt, or you can get seriously hurt, right? Because somebody may just pull a bigger gun and shoot you, right?
mm,
So we have, I because I see these fights among girls in the hospital every day. It is, I mean, people have to intervene and separate them, right? They just won't stop. There's so much passion in the interaction that becomes very destructive.
yeah, as you said, that's really about control. And Juan Pablo, you and I were briefly chatting, and my background in Muay Thai and MMA and all that stuff, and in your background in wrestling, you made an interesting statement, and I totally agree that people who train in combat sports or even martial arts, paradoxically, tend to be less violent. It gives them a release. It gives them something to do. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that. And then, Doctor, I'd
Yeah,
love to hear your take on it.
yeah,
Go ahead.
that uh, I think that combat sports, organized, you know, uh, violence, right? What's under control. You're doing it for sport. There's rules and things like that. Can actually be a great way to express yourself. I actually think that sometimes kids who lack vocabulary skills and emotional intelligence intelligence are the types of kids who end up getting in fights in school and things like that. And adults, right? Like I've seen it, you know, I went to Arizona State University and I hung out on Mill Avenue in college and things like that. And oftentimes, it wasn't, intelligent students getting in fights as, random grown men who, I don't know if they went to college or if they had a high level of education or whatever it was. It just seemed like they weren't the brightest guys getting in fights, and maybe it was a way that they were trying to express themselves. I think that when you have the opportunity to express yourself physically in organized combat, it becomes very spiritual. Vincent, as you know, in martial arts, they focus tremendously on the spirit and on your will and there's this insane amount of respect in martial arts. I think that my sport, wrestling, we're starting to see that more and more. Where when I was a kid, it was very old school. Wrestling was this very hard nosed, very grindy type of sport. If you study wrestlers from Russia, the former Soviet Union, Iran, Japan, these countries that have dominated wrestling for a very long time, they incorporate a lot of the spiritual aspect to it. And there's a release of energy and a release of anger that happens when you have a controlled fight, that you realize the repercussions of your actions, of your physical actions. And the other thing too is fighting is very difficult. Fighting well is very difficult. A wrestling match is only 6 minutes long, right? But I don't think most people could wrestle for 1 minute against their friend living room, Same thing with boxing or Muay Thai. If you ask a person who's never done it before to hit the bag for a minute, that's very physically difficult. And I'm sure there's science behind the physical release of energy and how that impacts your decision making and things like that. And I think that it can be used as a tool to express yourself when done correctly.
You
Doctor,
know,
what's your take on that?
well, I think that being sure of yourself, being secure, and having a good sense of self, which at the end of the day is the purpose of growing up, so you can be balanced, right? This doesn't require that you express violence as a form of self-esteem, right? When you start developing the idea that you are valuable because you can fight, you're gonna fight, right? And there's going to be different levels of dominance that people will going to try to reach, because that's the only way you can find a sense of purpose, right? And we see that among gangs a lot, and I don't want to negate the concept, the risk associated with poverty, right, and lack of education in terms of violence, right? Because in certain spheres, violence becomes a survival skill.
Mhm.
I mean, I had to tell you because I see a lot of low income dropout from high school kids that come into the hospital, suicidal, homicidal, violent, psychotic, substance abuse. And I always have to tell them, right, that we have to recognize the fact that they have survival skills. Maybe it's not survival skills that any of us will use, but for them have been valuable because they have kept them alive, right? So we can identify the survival skills and we can build from that instead of just being critical of the fact that they tend to utilize violence, right? Because for that individual in particular, right? Let me give you an example. I'm talking to a girl this morning. She comes in because she's high on meth and she's delusional and she belongs to a gang. And you start talking about, well, what does it take for you to survive in that environment? Well, she said, well, I have to make sure that I don't get raped, right? And I don't get jumped in by the other male members of the gang. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in subcultures that we take when we live in the bubble of middle class, middle income, high school, college education. We forget that there's a whole other world that we refuse to take a look at. And that is because, and Juan Pablo, you work in schools that are lower income schools, And you can see that a lot of these kids have issues of violence at home, the issues of poverty. They're starting from a negative perspective, surviving, right? So we have to be able to balance that and to help them develop a self-esteem that they can turn into positivity, and instead of just focusing on you're a bad person, because that's what we've done forever, right? We start pushing the people away. They start feeling it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everything that I hear, and I hear this from the kids, is that I'm not worth anything. Okay, so guess what? I'm going to be the best at doing the worst, because
Mhm.
that's the only thing that people recognizes as something, right? So we need to start changing that. But Juan Pablo was very interested in knowing. You see, for us from the outside, I mean, I see consequences, but I don't have an idea of what happens in the school environment when you get bombarded by all of this negativity about the school violence, right? Those of us from the outside, we look at it as, gosh, what is it like to work there, right? I mean, is it something that people talk about? Is it something that is dealt with? I'm not sure there are going to be differences between teachers and administration, but what is your perspective on what goes on in the school?
It's when a fight happens on campus, um, there's a lot of different takes that in schools, and I think this is a better situation. I've seen schools really try to dig deep into what happened, what was the root cause, and what is a fair consequence and judgment, and a good, intelligent way to proceed so that the fight doesn't happen again. That takes a lot of work and that takes a lot of manpower to achieve. And I've also seen schools have like the zero tolerance policy, right? The kid who started the fight gets more of a suspension than the kid who just defended themselves, or both kids get equal consequences. It didn't matter who got in the fight. I mean, the full spectrum of consequences and ways of dealing with it that you could think of happen in schools all the time, right? Um,
Mhm.
the the biggest thing that I've seen is that a kid gets in a fight, the administrator has just enough time to meet with one kid, meet with the other kid, talk to one set of parents, talk to the other set of parents, and issue out a consequence. And there's no additional work done to help that kid.
Mhm.
And when you do that, I think that you just perpetuate it. You make it seem like, okay, like I handled that situation then. There was an action, there was a consequence, but obviously when there's a fight, something's going to change, right? Either it's going to escalate or the kid's going to back down, depending how the fight went, or the kids are just going to forever be mad at each other. I mean, there's going to be a change after a fight. Um, you know, I've sat in on meetings with kids before because I get to know my students really well. I ask them about their personal life. I make them comfortable and they confide in me and tell me when they have conflicts with other kids. And most of the time, even kids who have that background that you were talking about, who maybe are in a gang, like I've sat down with a kid who's in a gang before and asked him like why are you in this? And oftentimes it is a survival situation. And I've sat down with those kids before and they don't want to fight. They, like you said, they want to feel that worth. They don't want to be disrespected. They don't want to feel weak. And we've been able to handle situations really well when we get to know these kids. And last week, Vincent, you asked me, are teachers who do that the exception? And I ruminated on that question a lot since our last episode. And yes, I think they are. I think teachers who get to know their kids, administrators who get to know their kids enough to be able to solve these issues, um, moving forward, I think there's less of us, less and less every year for sure. Um, and
How
it's
how
unfortunate.
how big of a problem is violence in schools? Like in a middle class school like yours? I mean, is it like an everyday thing?
Um, at my school, I'm lucky it's not an everyday thing here. Last year, it was a weekly thing. Um, I know that there's schools that I find that when you have different socioeconomic groups in a school, when you have a wide range of socioeconomic groups in a school, um, that's when a lot of the fighting happens. I used to uh, be involved through the school in itself, neighborhood that had, $1 million homes. That school
Mhm.
happened to bus in a lot of kids from South Phoenix.
Mhm.
And these South Phoenix kids felt this disconnection from the community and from the school. And there was, we looked at the statistics of violence in the district at the time, and there was a much higher statistical um, probability of fights happening at that school. So I think it has a lot to do with, like you said, the background of the students for sure. But
Okay.
it depends. I mean, it really depends because what is violence, right? Is it two kids getting in a fight? Is it a gang of kids jumping one kid? Is it girls fighting? Is it the school gets shot up? Because if a school has been shot up once in the last 10 years, that's kind of a lot, right? Like I'm lucky, in Arizona, I don't know of a big school shooting. I don't know if you guys do or not. I've never heard of a mass shooting at a school in Arizona.
Not mass, just targeted, like the
Yeah.
professor that was recently killed.
Yeah, but you see, I think that you brought up a number of issues, and all of them are, I think, are very important. Uh, because I don't want to leave the audience with the idea that we should not have mixture of socioeconomic levels in different schools, but we have to be very proactive on the how to. If you're going to do that, you have to anticipate risk, because when you ask the question of what is violence, violence is actually any form of dominance that makes you feel uncomfortable, right?
Mm,
Because it can be verbal violence, it can be physical violence, it can be online violence, anything that is trying to make you feel dominated, that somebody's got power over you, and that you need to quote unquote stay in your place, right? So any of those behaviors will have consequences. And I'm not terribly concerned as a provider of mental health services in terms of an episode of violence. Why is that? Because the whole purpose of adolescence, okay, is to grow into learning to control your aggression and impulsivity, right? So there's going to be a lot of practicing, and it's practicing that is acceptable and practice that is not. For example, sports, right? Sports actually, football, basketball, wrestling, they're kind of teaching you the how to. How do you go about handling that aggression? Uh, but there's also part of you growing up as an adolescent to learn to manage your sexual aggression, right?
mm,
And that's where things get very passionate sometimes, because kids become owners. Said that boy or that girl is my property and nobody's going to look at her, blah, 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 blah. And then you get into practicing dominance, I am the alpha male, I'm the alpha female, whatever, and nobody can touch my property, right? Well, that's part of growing up. It's part of learning that to control that sexual aggression, and some people have the tools better prepared than others, right? And some people feel left out. So all of that is going to create emotions. So an incident of violence doesn't mean that there's a problem. It means that we need to explore it, to understand it, to give those people a tool, right? Now, I always like to say, I'm always looking for frequency, intensity, and dysfunction, right? So a kid who's consistently aggressive in most situations and all usually problem solve in an aggressive way and is not learning and is going downhill, right? You can almost predict that kid's not going to make it here, right? So that kid needs a more intensive intervention, right? I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, I see those kids. I see the that extreme of the kids where you have to take extreme um, precautions, if you may, to reduce it. So I mean, I think that we have a lot more material to continue talking about this a little more. Maybe we'll get together next week and just continue talking a little bit about the how to, right? How do we go about it?
Excellent. Once again, thank you, Juan Pablo, Mr. Teacher Man, and Dr. Patino. And we'll see everybody again next week.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank. Okay, we'll see you soon. You there?
There we go. Yep.
Okay.
Gotta find. Are you gonna? I go to dinner.
Okay. Take care. Bye bye.
Take care.